So both of us watched Hamilton a couple times, and you saw some really pretty big biblical themes there. I noticed those as well, but also I saw some different just overall themes for the musical as a whole. And there's two really, really prominent characters in Hamilton. There's Alexander Hamilton, the titular character, but also his quasi-rival Aaron Burr. These two probably have the most lines, the most songs, the most everything in this musical. And they really are kind of compared and contrasted with one another throughout the whole musical. And I thought there was something interesting to draw out from that and talk about kind of the approaches that, at least as portrayed in the musical, that each of these gentlemen had with their whole lives. How do I approach life? How do I go about getting things done that I want to accomplish in this lifetime?
Both of those characters in that musical are presented as contrasts to each other throughout the whole thing. I mean, really, from very early on, it's interesting. Burr, you might can think of him as the villain of the musical, and really, he's almost a protagonist because the musical starts with him singing, and it shows things that are favorable about him, or at least reasonable from his perspective. But he is shown as being a foil to Hamilton, or vice versa.
Yeah.
And the two are contrasted in their worldviews.
Yes.
And so, again, pastorally, that's where that catches us. You know, like, well, we care about what worldview people have and how they approach life and what they think is right for their actions and that kind of thing. And so you get two totally different approaches, two different sets of strategies and tactics from each of them. And at one point in the musical, they flip-flop sort of.
A little bit.
Yeah. At least they make reference to that to each other. And so you wanted to lay this out and kind of, pick apart some of the pieces here.
Yeah. Why don't we spend a little bit of time? Why don't we look at each character?
Okay.
Talk about how their kind of approaches are presented in the musical, and then maybe you can help us fill in some of the gaps with some of the actual history. Because one thing we should maybe say is that this musical, I would say, is extremely historical. Its historical value is very, very top notch. I mean,
Yeah.
Lin-Manuel Miranda, he worked with historians and fact checkers,
Yeah,
right?
well, it's based on an award-winning book and a biography of Hamilton by I wouldn't know his name.
I think is his last name.
Yeah, well, he's the guy that just did the Grant biography
okay.
that's on my wish list to read. But yeah, so this book about Hamilton, award-winning, extremely comprehensive book, became the basis for the musical, and then that author served as an historical consultant,
Yeah.
supervisor, whatever. Yeah, and so there's so many things as a history nerd watching Hamilton, there are so many things they get right, and a lot of drama, and both on stage and on film, are so bad about anachronisms and just costuming and language is all so wrong, and there is some deliberate anachronisms with the music and the dialogue, to make it contemporary dialogue.
But they're charming.
Yes. Well, it's done deliberately. It wasn't accidental.
Right.
They got the history stuff right, or it was at least condensed in an acceptable way, to streamline it for a drama. So it wasn't an 8-hour musical,
Well, speaking of which, when you watch this, because you should watch Hamilton.
Yeah, I'd recommend it, especially the Disney version where they
Yes.
kind of bleep out a little bit of the cursing.
I appreciated that. But watch it with subtitles. There is a lot to catch. And because basically the entire musical is all music, there's really no dialogue sections. They get a lot of words in there. I think you told me it was like, what? If it was just a regular pace of a normal musical, it would have been like 6.5 hours long.
Yes. The number of words per minute for a typical musical, Hamilton is so dense that it would have been a 6-hour musical if it had gone at the same pace. Instead, it goes much faster. And God bless you if you can listen to Hamilton for the first time without subtitles
And catch everything? Oh, no way.
You are a champ. God bless you. You're amazing, because even with subtitles, it's coming at you fast.
Yeah.
And it's pretty historically accurate. There's not any grievous errors. Like I said, there's a few places where, because of the purpose of drama, it's streamlined. And, the words of one person will be put into the words of a character already on stage.
Yeah, they conflate characters sometimes.
Yeah, so you'll have Jefferson speaking for John Adams because John Adams isn't represented on stage.
Right.
And so you'll have a few times where that happens, but for the most part, it's pretty accurate, which is interesting then to try to learn what the historical worldviews were of those real people.
Yes.
Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton.
So let's talk about these two characters. First, you've got Alexander Hamilton. Here is a guy who, certainly you could describe him as full of ambition, but he is portrayed as very headstrong, very aggressive and assertive, and he's a visionary. He's got all sorts of dreams and beliefs, and he is all about this revolution that's happening. And in the aftermath of the revolution, there's a new constitution that needs to be done and a whole new country, and he just wants every part of that. He wants to place his stamp, his mark upon the foundation of this new form of government.
Now, there's two things I think that are happening there, just to play armchair psychologist. I think that, first of all, Alexander Hamilton, the real person and the character in the show, are highly intelligent.
Yes.
And highly intelligent people tend to have a little more hubris. They tend to think, well, I'm right because I thought it. And duh, of course, I'm used to being
the person. Get on board with my plan because it's the right one.
I'm looking in the mirror a little bit here. You just assume that you're right, and a smart person often gets in the habit of being the one that's right. And so that creates a bit of a blind spot, and it can be an unattractive quality in a person. It's useful to have somebody who's fast thinking and on top of it, but it can also be kind of negative hubris-wise. The second element being that he was an orphan and an immigrant.
Needed to prove himself a little bit.
And trying to prove himself. Yeah. And so he's pushing even harder. Not only is he smart, thinks he's right, but he's determined to prove. He's got like a chip on his shoulder because he thinks, well, no one's going to listen to me, so I've got to push extra hard to get my ideas out in front of people. Yeah.
And we notice this numerous times in the musical, and there's all sorts of musical numbers or quotes that he has in these musical numbers that allude to this. He says a couple times in the musical, there's a million things I haven't done, but just you wait. I'm going to do those things. And one of his mantra kind of throughout the show is, I'm not throwing away my shot. Like, I've got something in front of me or before me here, and I'm going to seize it. I'm going to seize the day. I'm going to grab the bull by the horns. I am going to make this happen and not lose out or miss out on something that could be great.
And I really appreciated it because when I first heard it in the musical, I thought, oh, that is just an ironic foreshadowing to the duel that he's going to lose because he appears to not have tried to shot. He didn't try to take a shot at Aaron Burr. He seems to have just pointed his pistol in the sky.
Meaning he threw away his shot?
Right. He literally will throw away his shot, it seems. At least most observers, saw it happen. But he also, it's a good description of his ambition, of Alexander Hamilton's ambition that I'm just going to seize every single opportunity. I'm never going to let a single one go by. I can't stop working for a second because I have to capitalize on every moment, on every opportunity.
Yeah, and those moments are definitely there in the musical. He meets Aaron Burr early on in the musical. I don't know if this is a historical moment or probably not, but Burr was an orphan too, actually. And Hamilton says to Burr, I wish there was a war, some way we could prove ourselves, which, say what you will about that. There's probably other ways to prove yourself, but Hamilton, he wants to command soldiers. And this guy knows almost nothing about anything military related. I mean, did he have any kind of military training?
He did a little bit. Like a lot of academics, the academic area, if you don't know, of the Army is artillery. They're the ones who actually had to do math to do their job, right? And I'm not kidding. I mean, when the Civil War started, or really almost any time through history, the intellectuals immediately go into artillery,
Right.
And so Hamilton actually did have a very brief stint with an artillery company in New York City, and there's just the slightest reference to it. Him and one of the other side characters are going to go steal some cannons.
I recall
they did
this.
steal some. There's like one or two references to it, but so he did briefly have like an actual combat experience sort of situation, but it wasn't like that was his career.
Right. Well, he ends up ingratiating himself to the main guy at this point, George Washington, and he becomes his aide de camp. Is that how you would say it?
Yeah, well, he's a secretary.
Yeah.
He's going to do all of the paperwork for the general, which it may sound demeaning or something. That's actually extremely important.
He writes all his correspondences.
Yes. Yeah. When George Washington asks the Continental Congress for money and for supplies, that's Alexander Hamilton writing that.
Right.
He's at George Washington's order. He's writing that letter and making that request, successful or not successful.
But in the musical, he's portrayed as really wanting to have a command. He wants to command some troops, and Washington actually says to him, young man, you want to be a martyr? Like almost like you just want to rush headlong and you just want to be, immortalized in this war. And he tells him, you want to be a martyr? Dying is easy. Living is harder, which that actually reminded me of a biblical theme in Philippians 1:21 when Paul says, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. That was a little interesting moment, but he keeps on just wanting things, right? And he does end up commanding some of his own troops.
Yes, at the end of the war at Yorktown, he has
not before he is told to go home by George Washington, because apparently his wife Eliza has written George Washington that she's expecting their first child.
Yeah. There's a lot going on there historically that is getting kind of condensed and brushed over, and I'm really not an authority on all of what's going on there, but a lot of people don't have a good concept of how long the war was. They don't have a good idea that, that wasn't just, there was the Minutemen, take their shots at the Redcoats, and then there was a really cold winter at Valley Forge.
And then the Battle of Yorktown.
Then the Battle of Yorktown, it's all over. It's took 3 weeks. They don't understand that this actually goes on for some time. And there's a significant amount of keeping our distance from the British Army and playing for time.
Yep.
And so during that period of okay, we're going to try to kind of bleed them dry.
And make their citizens be angry about continuing to pay for this stupid war.
Yeah. Well, let's make Parliament turn on King George III. And by making this expensive. And then while we're playing for time, we're also wanting to bring in the French. And if the French can bring more people, more money, more ships, especially to the fight, then which is also referenced in Hamilton, then this will start to lean our way. And all we have to do is make this too unpleasant, and the British will go home. And so there is time there for different battles to happen and for people to take a leave of absence and go home. And Hamilton, the musical, plays on that and shows a kind of condensed version where you get some good character development between him and his wife right here in the midst of the Revolutionary War part of the story.
And you can tell there's some time lapse going on.
Yeah.
But after the war, he still has ambitions. And actually, there's a song in the musical that Aaron Burr sings called Nonstop. And he's describing Alexander Hamilton's habits. And he's like, this guy is just nonstop. He writes and writes and writes like he's running out of time. And the dude just works, 20 hours a day. He just never quits.
Now, isn't that difficult, though? Because is that a good quality? Or is that a bad quality?
Well, it depends, right? Our nation. This is something we gotta hold up the mirror for ourselves. The Puritans and everything.
Talking about the Puritan work ethic.
Yeah, we're a nation that really is all about putting in hard days' work after hard days' work. But frankly, that's led to some pretty unhealthy habits of us as a nation. I was just talking to my mom about this. She works for, basically the world's biggest corporation, Walmart, and they're open all the time. They want, it's all about the bottom dollar. She works in the Vision Center, and some of the times that the Vision Center is open are astounding to me. I'm like, who needs glasses at 4 p.m. on a Sunday? You know what I mean?
Right.
And it's just nonstop.
Yeah.
And
which has made us very prosperous, our productivity has, but it's also led to the idea of being workaholics. And there are a lot of unhealthy attitudes
and
about
high
work.
divorce rates and
Yes.
decline in family life and decline in actual joy and satisfaction.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people who make a lot of money who are very unhappy. They're
Yeah.
miserable.
Yeah. And so again, worldview wise, you think, oh, well, what a great quality to have that he just works. He's always doing all these different things. Hamilton, for instance, at one point, right after the Revolutionary War, suddenly he's a lawyer. And the audience may be like, oh, I missed that part. Well, you didn't miss anything. He took the bar after studying for like less than 6 months. I mean, he didn't spend years in college.
He took the fast track approach.
Yes, he just, I think I'll be a lawyer this year. And so took the test, passed, and immediately he's practicing law.
Which Burr was also a lawyer,
yes,
is
he
that
was.
correct?
Yes, he was. And so it puts you in a kind of a funny place that it's good that he's working hard. It's impressive, and as Americans in our culture, we really value people who work hard and achieve, but that does come at a cost. And I think the musical does a good job of showing that it doesn't just applaud it blindly. It shows it and says, oh, look, this is a good thing, but it's also got a bad side.
And he's full of ambition for nearly everything in the musical, right? For wealth, fame, power, women, military might, and his legacy. He just writes so much stuff. In fact, the Federalist Papers, a series of papers that were written trying to really defend the Constitution to the newly formed American people.
Yeah, trying to sell it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He wrote 51 out of 85 of them, which originally there were only supposed to be 25 total, but he just went crazy.
He may have helped on the others, not because he had those were uniquely his, but then he may have helped on some of the others too. And so he did the lion's share of that work to sell us on this new Constitution.
But you talked about the cost, and it seems like maybe he didn't know how to enjoy life. There's a scene we talked about where he's supposed to he should probably go with his family and summer with them. And instead he forsakes his family and healthy pleasures and joys and ends up needing some kind of release somehow. He needs some kind of pleasure in his life.
He falls to temptation.
Yeah.
Yeah. He says in the musical, I haven't slept in a week. And I was watching it and just thinking, oh man, you are so vulnerable.
Yep.
Because you've made yourself, the hungry, angry, lonely, tired. You've made yourself tired, and now you're vulnerable to these temptations. And it just killed me that he was such a smart guy, but foolishly worked so hard that it set him up for personal moral failure.
And there are always costs to these levels of deep ambition or just headstrongness or desires for greatness. Losing friends, gaining enemies, potentially, forsaking wisdom in blind pursuit of your ambitions, even potentially doing things like besmirching your own name and your family's name to acquit yourself or make yourself have the moral high ground or something like that.
Yeah. Willing to overlook the personal cost, the personal toll to others.
For the professional benefit or boon that it might give you. And it seems like he learns in the musical some really good, deep truths later in his life, but only after tons of damage had already been done.
Well, specifically, you see after the loss of his son in a duel that he kind of coached him on and didn't stop him from doing. Alexander's son Philip dies, and it's at that point that the Reynolds pamphlet has come out. The son has died, and their retirement uptown has kind of turned into this lonely, introspective, quiet time where he's not actively working. He's in the garden. He's walking up the street to the store. It's very unambitious, and it's the only season in his life where he's not running, with the throttle maxed out.
Yeah. Well, we contrast a character like him with the other main character in the musical, Aaron Burr. Mm-hmm. In some ways, the musical maybe portrays him as a little bit passive or timid, but he's still an ambitious guy. I mean, this is one of the founding fathers, even though he's not in like the circle of the all-time elites, right?
Yeah, he's not on Mount Rushmore.
No.
No.
Well, and most people, probably the thing that they know about Aaron Burr is, well, isn't that the guy that maybe shot Alexander Hamilton in a duel? I don't even know how many people could say that he was a sitting vice president when he did that.
Yeah. He killed Hamilton while actively the vice president of the United States.
Right.
Yeah, and he wanted to be president. He wanted to be significant, but his ambition had a different flavor to it.
Exactly.
And in some ways was kind of opposite in approach and strategy and tactics to Alexander Hamilton.
I think the word that comes to mind for me is opportunistic. He is trying to seize whatever opportunity that will advance him and his own cause. Because in many ways, Hamilton really seemed like he was concerned for the greater good of the nation. And even though it was his ideas and his legacy, he wanted things to go well for the nation as a whole. Whereas Burr is portrayed more as wanting whatever of his own power and prestige he can have. And who cares about parties or whatever? I'll just go with whatever party maybe could get me elected or maybe get me in a little bit more influence or power.
One of the more interesting tidbits that I learned that I didn't know before this, because I'm not a big history buff on the Revolutionary War. Certainly have done a lot of reading, but not as much as I have in other areas. But one of the things I learned was that at one point in the Revolutionary War that Burr worked for Benedict Arnold. And Benedict Arnold, very famously, he was this war hero that kept getting shot out of the saddle and, was always injured because he's such a valiant warrior. But as soon as he didn't get the appreciation that he thought he deserved, was willing to switch sides and fight for the British. And sold West Point and betrayed them and went over to the British side. And you think, Benedict Arnold, one of the worst traitors in U.S. history. I mean, the name almost means traitor. And Aaron Burr, for a while, worked for him. And I think I see commonality in them.
Well, I saw something similar. I read something that Aaron Burr actually committed some sort of very noble and valiant act of war where he saved a whole bunch of his men.
Okay.
And in General Washington's orders or, whatever message that he would send out every week or whatever.
At the Battle of Monmouth.
Yeah, there was no mention of it. And Aaron Burr was not pleased about this. And I think maybe even left the military for a time period there.
Yeah, well, he changed what he was doing from being an active officer in the field to working with some of the espionage. There was one of the big stories, if you're interested in history, one of the interesting aspects of the Revolutionary War is the amount of espionage that was happening because the British were occupying us. And so anytime, they occupied New York, they occupied other places, there were American citizens in and around and intermingled with them all the time. So there was quite a bit of espionage happening.
And they mentioned that a little bit.
In that for a while.
They mentioned that a little bit in the musical. There's a character named Hercules Mulligan, and he apparently was an American spy on the British side and helped us to, conquer.
Smuggled out messages in the clothing. He was a tailor and so.
But Burr in numerous ways, he's portrayed as somewhat passive in the musical. Alexander Hamilton says to him at one point, "If you stand for nothing, Burr, what'll you fall for? Like, what do you really believe in? What are your core convictions?" And at one point, Burr says to Washington, "Sir, I really admire how you keep firing on the British from a distance. That you're sort of not being aggressive, and you're kind of staying back." And to some degree, like you mentioned, that was actually maybe somewhat beneficial. But in the scene in the musical, Washington says, like, "Okay, Burr, great, get out of here." And then Hamilton comes in and he's like, "You need to be my right-hand man, Hamilton, because you're a really strong, aggressive, assertive guy." And that's probably not historically accurate, but it's how it's portrayed in the character development. And at one point, Alexander Hamilton even says to Burr, "Burr, I'll never understand you." Because Aaron Burr had a relationship with a woman named Theodosia who was married to a British officer.
Yeah.
And he had a fairly open relationship with this woman. And her husband actually ended up dying. And just like maybe a year later, he married her. But Alexander Hamilton says to Burr in the musical, "If you love this woman, go get her," which is kind of funny because he's sort of just like openly promoting adultery. Like, go be with this man's wife if she's what you want.
But it matches Hamilton's worldview.
Aggressiveness.
I think something, therefore it's correct, and so I'm just going to go do it without a lot of other thought. And it shows Burr in contrast, where he's like, "Well, I'm going to wait, and now's not the time." And Burr's not the kind that's going to swoop in and woo that woman and pull her away from her husband. He's going to wait for the husband to die and be out of the picture,
exactly,
and be a little more cautious about it.
And if Hamilton's mantra is "I'm not throwing away my shot," Burr's mantra is "wait for it." There's a song he sings called that, and he even says, "I'll wait here and see which way the wind will blow." And he is ambiguous throughout the musical about his political beliefs or about his platform or even about his party affiliation. I mean, really, he's a New Yorker. Theoretically, he should be a Federalist. That's one of the two parties. And the more Southern party at the time, the one that James Madison and Thomas Jefferson belonged to, was the Democratic Republicans. But he ends up being a Democratic Republican, it seems like, because he feels like it'll help him a little bit more to achieve greater things. And
that's cast in the play as being a negative.
Yes.
That Burr not being willing to stand up and just speak his mind, Burr not being aggressive to go, pursue his desires, Burr being willing to switch horses in, midstream or whatever, that is almost universally cast as negative, at least through the first portion. You see until it's necessary for Hamilton to back off a bit.
Right.
When he's got to push his thing through Congress, he's actually got to be nice to people.
Yeah.
It's not until that point do you finally get something positive. And I think that matches our American culture. People who waffle, people who switch teams, we generally frown on that. I mean, just this last week, there's a congressman who was Republican, and then he switched to being independent, and then he switched again to libertarian, making him the first libertarian congressman, even though he wasn't elected as such.
Right.
And he's like, "I'm going to run for president as libertarian." But after all those switches, and there may be more to the story. He's not from our state, but after all those switches, he then says, "Okay, I'm not going to run for president." And then, like the very next day, he goes, "I'm not going to run for Congress next term either."
Oh my!
I mean, he basically, he's 40 years old and his career's over, and he may have had who knows what reasons for switching from party to party to party, but
might have went with the direction the wind was blowing just a little bit too much.
A little too much, and people don't like that. And so same thing with Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr switches from Federalist to Democratic Republican, right? And so those were two parties that don't really exist now entirely. But the Federalist Party, Washington didn't have a party. John Adams, second president, was Federalist, the only one elected as Federalist.
Yep.
And then the opposition party, if the Federalists were big government, let's make a strong central government, which is what federalism means. Then the opposition to that, led largely by Thomas Jefferson, were the Democratic Republicans. And
Probably more about states' rights.
Let's push governmental authority as local as possible. And if the Democratic Republicans had their choice, we'd have virtually no government. We'd have no standing army. We'd have no significant government in Washington. And that's inherited down to now, kind of. Some of that you can find in libertarians. They tend to like really small, limited government, but it wouldn't exactly be accurate to call them libertarians back then.
Sure.
But those were the two parties. Yeah. And Burr switched. Burr switched from big, powerful central government to, we don't want big government. And he just switched.
And even though he's portrayed as maybe a little bit timid in the musical, it's not like he had zero ambitions. I mean, the man did run on the ticket with Thomas Jefferson and actually got pretty close to winning the presidency. He was close. We'll talk about that more in a second. Yeah. But it's more about his approach to life, right?
Yes.
I mean, he does things. He takes Philip Schuyler, who is Alexander Hamilton's father-in-law.
Right.
He ends up taking his Senate seat at one point.
And Burr was personal friends with the Schuyler family.
Yes.
Okay. And so this wasn't just, some other dude has this political position, I'll just take it because it's available. It was a little bit of personal betrayal to snatch up that seat.
Yeah.
And
Burr even says in the musical, I want to be in the room where it happens, where all the big decisions get made. And apparently, at least from the perspective of many of the other founding fathers I've read through looking at different historical works, it seems like they've thought that he had his own interests at heart more than the nation's interests at heart.
You can find several quotes from Washington and others that basically, Burr was a capable Army officer, but I don't really trust him.
And so his wait for it approach doesn't necessarily work either. He even says, speak less, smile more, don't let them know what you're against or what you're for. And to be fair, I do resonate with that a little bit because I'm not the kind of person who wants, I play things, close to the chest a little bit. I don't necessarily want to just put all my cards out there all the time or be like, yeah, really assertive, I'm going this direction. But when you're a really, really waffly individual and it leads to you having all this personal, selfish ambition, that's not good. That's not healthy.
Well, we talked just a bit about how waffling and switching teams is viewed negatively in our culture for several legitimate reasons. There's a bit of untrustworthiness. What do you really believe? That kind of thing. But at the same time, the super aggressive Alexander Hamilton would have been on Twitter. Okay, if he was alive now, he would have been on Twitter.
Let us know every single thought.
He would have given us his opinion on everything, whether we wanted it or not. Yeah. And what happens on Twitter is everyone else does the same, and it becomes this nasty, venomous, toxic place. And so
some silence can be a good thing, and also flexibility can be a good thing. Yeah. Sometimes it makes sense to say, actually, I need to switch directions right now in my life or in my viewpoints or in any of the above categories.
Well, if you're so firm in your convictions like Alexander Hamilton, you will drive away everyone because there's no one that thinks exactly like you on every single item. I mean, can you ever work on a team? Can you ever work with anybody that might be a bit of a rival? One of the things in American history that's held up as a good quality, in spite of not liking people who waffle, we look at both George Washington, who never committed to a political party and had people in his cabinet who were diametrically opposed, and Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, who had famously a team of rivals, where his cabinet was brought in people who were absolutely opposed to one another, hated each other's guts. But both of those men got those groups to work together and were criticized for it, but it was ultimately a good thing to be able to work with people who didn't exactly agree with you. That's
the funny thing is,
virtue.
We almost recognize them at an even higher level of greatness than the people who try and take everything for themselves or make it the way that exactly they want it to be.
So I'm seeing in both of these guys a pattern where Hamilton's just single-minded, ambitious, I'm going to do everything, and Burr's hang back and kind of see which way the wind blows. Both of them are both good and bad.
They are.
Especially when taken to the extremes that those two characters go to. They both have attributes that could be positive. That could be a good and virtuous thing to take either of those approaches, but can also be a destructive and even sinful thing to take either of those approaches. It would require wisdom.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. Well, let's talk for a minute about these two together, because like I said, they're almost portrayed as frenemies, right? And it's almost like their fates are entwined in this musical. You already know the ending. They say it at the beginning. Aaron says, I'm the fool that shot him, you know? So you know where it's going. And there's all these different illusions, right? They're both lawyers at the same time. And then there's the scene that happens.
They're both soldiers at the same time.
They're soldiers at the same time. And apparently there's this duel that happens between one of Alexander Hamilton's close friends, John Laurens, and another guy named General Charles Lee, who apparently wasn't a very good general and kind of criticized General Washington. And so John Laurens is like, you're not going to drag Washington's name through the mud, and challenges him to a duel. And in the musical, Hamilton and Aaron Burr are these two men's seconds.
Right.
They're like their lieutenants.
Right.
Well, I learned that was just a little bit of a historical inaccuracy. Actually, I did some research on this. Hamilton was John Laurens' second, but General Lee's second was a man named Evan Edwards, who, by the way, was Aaron Burr's cousin. It's so funny just how small the world was. There are all these different connections. Like Aaron Burr says, my grandfather was a fire and brimstone preacher. His grandfather was Jonathan Edwards. Yes, really? very like the most famous
I didn't know that.
Minister pre-revolutionary. And we know Aaron gets in a duel with Hamilton, but he also got into a duel with Angelica's husband, whose name is John Barker Church. Mm-hmm. So it's just all these connections to me were hilarious. But I actually read the document because the seconds, these lieutenants, they have to like fill out a report basically about the duels that happen and like the outcomes of them. You should read one of these sometime. They're hilarious. Alexander Hamilton and Evan Edwards are writing about this duel between John Laurens and Charles Lee. And it's like talking about, their personal affronts and their honor. And both these dudes lined up. Both took a shot. Charles Lee missed and John Laurens hit Lee. Mm-hmm. And at that point in time, they stopped the duel. It was like, whoa, Lee's been hit. But then after a few minutes, he's like, oh, it was basically just a flesh wound. It's not too big a deal. Let's do second shots. And Hamilton and Edwards are like, yeah, let's not do that. And Lee, and they're like, but he was pretty persistent. Yeah, we should do that. And then they're both like, no, really, let's not. And Lee's like, well, only if Laurens is okay with it. And he's like, yeah, I'm fine. And they like shook hands and it was all good. And their honor was completely, left intact. But it is just hilarious reading through these from a modern perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you mentioned Burr, being the second to Lee, and Lee was critical of Washington. It still makes sense, even though that's not historically exactly the way it happened. Burr was associated with several people who were anti-Washington. Later, after him and Hamilton have their duel, then you have this episode where Burr goes out west and gets involved out in Texas and the American Southwest with some followers and a Revolutionary War general, actually a guy who was still in the Army. In fact, he was the ranking officer. He was the highest ranking officer. His last name was Wilkinson. And Wilkinson actually had to resign back during the Revolutionary War because he was part of a cabal that was against Washington. and actually resigned twice there. And then War of 1812, a little bit later, he has, fights 2 battles, loses them both. The dude's a mess. Turns out at years later, like 30 years later, they go through the records in Spain and find out that Spain had been paying him as a spy for years. The highest paid was Agent 13. And this guy gets involved with Burr and ends up throwing Burr under the bus and says, "Oh, Burr's trying to start his own country out here in Texas, and Burr is committing treason." So Jefferson, who's now president, brings Burr up on treason charges and puts him on trial, which he's acquitted. But Wilkinson is one of the key witnesses. Like, yeah, he was trying to get me to join this new country and take over, and it was treason.
That's too funny.
And so Burr is just. He does a terrible job of picking friends, a worse job of picking enemies.
Well, let's talk about Jefferson for a minute.
His ability to pick which way the wind blows is broken.
Yeah, right? Yeah. Let's talk about Jefferson for a minute. You mentioned him. This is kind of what leads up to the climactic duel at the end, right? There's the election of 1800. That's the election that Thomas Jefferson won. Right? And so walk us through this real quick. Like, how did Hamilton and Burr really become dislike each other at this moment?
Well, like I said, there were those parties, and the party system was just forming. We weren't really committed even to having just 2 parties. And so you didn't have each party just pick a candidate. You had a selection of candidates, and some of them may have been from the same party. And you're talking about much smaller numbers because there's fewer states. And it just was a simpler and less refined process. And so Burr had run in 1796 and lost to Adams. He came in 4th place. And then Thomas Jefferson was vice president, and the Federalist Party was not going to win, in part because of Hamilton. Hamilton and John Adams had turned on each other, and so the Federalist Party was going to be out. And so the Democratic Republicans were almost certainly going to win. And both Jefferson and Burr were on the slate of candidates with the assumption that it would go to Jefferson. But the candidate from the Democratic Republicans in the North was Burr, and Burr was up there in those population centers like Philadelphia and New York, and he had that northern connection with Jefferson, was southern, and he was doing some of the first political things really in American history. He's often considered the first modern politician of the United States of America because he was doing voter recruitment, voter drives, like let's get people registered to vote, let's get our lists of donors, and let's go house to house, door to door, and campaign, and so he was this political animal that was very different than specifically a Thomas Jefferson or a George Washington, both of whom saw themselves, right or wrong, they saw themselves as above that.
Yeah.
And that would have been crass behavior because they were men of principle.
They were distinguished.
Right. And Hamilton saw himself in that light more, even though he was, had this very close relationship with Washington and was diametrically opposed to most of Jefferson's principles. You see that in the musical that he'd rather pick Jefferson, which Hamilton ended up having influence in that election.
Right.
When they come down to a tie and it can go to Jefferson or Burr, either one of these Democratic Republicans.
Now the delegates, they have to vote amongst themselves.
Right. And so the Federalist delegates are influenced by Hamilton to throw their weight all toward Jefferson.
And in the musical, Hamilton actually says, I'm with Jefferson on this. And he says, Jefferson has beliefs, Burr has none.
Yeah.
Even though he's opposed to Jefferson's beliefs, but he says at least he wants to take us somewhere.
And Burr was a former Federalist. I mean, if you just talked about what kinds of things politically they stood for in the past, Burr and Hamilton probably had more in common. But Burr's waffling, his view of, I'll just change my stripes depending on what season it is, that was so offensive to the principles of Hamilton that supposedly is why he opposed him. Now, in the play, it seems like that is the direct antecedent to the duel. And that's condensing things a little bit because this happens And Burr actually becomes vice president because he places second, and that's how it worked back then. And him and Jefferson had this acrimonious relationship. It was clear Jefferson was not going to carry Burr on into the next election.
He kind of sidelined him during his presidency.
Very much, very much. And so Burr saw, well, if I can't run for president, then what else can I do? I'll run for governor of New York. And it's like our career politicians now, that they will be elected to something because that's apparently all they can do. And that we've kind of accepted it, but I think that's why Donald Trump got elected, in part because people saw him as an outsider, and that might be good. Well, it used to be all of our politicians, except for Aaron Burr, were outsiders to the political system. They were just temporarily on loan from private industry or the private life to go into politics. Where Burr was like, nope, I will be a politician.
Career politician.
I will be the president of something, somewhere, or the governor.
So he runs for governor of New York.
In that election, he sees active campaigning, which he actually doesn't find out about till later. We don't have the internet back then, right? And so some of Hamilton's active campaigning against Burr, and Burr discovers after the fact. So that becomes a point in which they start exchanging letters. I have the honor to be your obedient servant, A. Ham or A. Burr. And so, so you have this exchange of letters that ends up leading to the duel.
So then we get to this duel, and we don't have to go through the whole duel. People can read about that on their own. But
we don't want to give away all the spoilers.
No,
yeah.
But they do end up coming together, and it really is kind of debated on who shot first and who shot where. But here's what we know. Aaron Burr ended up hitting Alexander Hamilton. Yeah. Hamilton ends up dying from it about 30 hours later. Mm-hmm. Mortal wounds. And we see this reversal a little bit, where Hamilton, like you said earlier, throws away his shot. It's almost like he's learned a little bit. I don't need to be diametrically opposed to this person. I don't need to win the day, as it were.
Yeah.
And now Burr is going to finally take something. He's gonna take what he wants here in the moment, but it's too little, too late. It's almost like passive aggressive. You know what I mean? You blow up at the wrong time. It's like, no, this was not the moment to go grab what you want.
So many other times Burr could have stood for principle and didn't. Now suddenly, it's all about honor and principle.
And he's got the death of a man on his hands. Yeah. And he actually says in the musical, I should have known the world was wide enough for Hamilton and me. Yeah. It didn't have to be one of us or the other. And, he says, I survived, but I paid for it. And his political career was effectively over after this, because he was the sitting vice president. He lost the gubernatorial election, and that was it. He was kind of blackballed by the various other bigwigs at the time. Yeah,
he goes out west. He goes to Europe. He bounces around. At one point, he does get remarried. And immediately, because he's in land speculation, he's trying to get money and it's not working, and he starts using his wife's money, and so she divorces him. And another little nugget that I read, the woman hires an attorney to sue for divorce, and it's one of Hamilton's sons. That's the lawyer.
They're all connected.
Oh, poor Burr. Yes.
But I like that. And the musical really kind of leaves you to pick up the puzzle pieces at the end a bit, and I like that the musical doesn't do this typical thing where one person's the obvious, hero and one person's the obvious villain. Mm-hmm. They're both portrayed as not being perfectly complete. They're almost, like you said, opposite extremes. And both of those approaches have their problems in life. I actually... thinking about the Bible in a ministerial perspective, I thought about Abraham a little bit and how he goes through different periods in his life where, he does take initiative and it's a good thing, or he takes initiative and it's a bad thing. God tells him in Genesis chapter 12 to go out from his father's home country, and God doesn't say where, and Abraham does it. He embraces that spirit of adventure, and he goes out and is actually trying to do something.
Yeah.
But then later on, God's made him these promises about how he's going to have many descendants, and he's not willing to wait for it at that point in time. And so he sleeps with his maidservant, or Sarah's maidservant, Hagar, and is going to force it in his own time period. And that's
kind
not what God had for him.
Impulsive ambition there. Yeah.
And so I think there's something to be said about learning from these two gentlemen, especially as they're portrayed in the musical, and how there is a happy medium to be had here, where you're not all about waiting for things to come to you and your own blind, selfish ambition, but you're also not just trying to take and take and take and do more and gain whatever you can, even if it's based on some kind of grand principle or something like that.
Yeah. You said Abraham. I think of Peter, where you can kind of track Peter in the Gospels, where he seems very impulsive, very, cut the ear off of Malchus, kind of leap before you look, to maybe his epistle, where he's an elder, and he's an apostle and an elder, and now there's this calmer and more seasoned view. And so you see his personality maybe change over the course of the New Testament. And I think that it's refreshing to hear that whether you identified more with the ambition of Hamilton or the ambition of Burr and the different approaches they took to get there, the leap before you look, or the wait and see which way the wind blows, whichever one clicks with you more, I think there's encouragement in Scripture that God uses both kinds of people. Both kinds of people are sinners. Both kinds of people can be flawed in that approach, but God can still redeem that and use those people too.
Absolutely. And that we need discernment to try and figure out on a case-by-case basis, what does God have for us? What's God's will for us, as opposed to grabbing our own will for ourselves.
And there's a lot of wisdom in not being stuck in a rut, where maybe sometimes we need to hear the advice that the only wrong way to do something is do it the same way every time. And if we think, well, my approach worked back here, so I'm going to do that approach again. If you try that in your marriage or in parenting or really any other place where God puts you in life, you're at risk of missing what wisdom and discernment could bring, and say, okay, maybe I'm going to take a little bit different tactic here in dealing with this person or that person.
So that's Hamilton. All there is to be said about it, right?
Right. There can't possibly. It's fortunate these will be the only things on the internet ever said about Hamilton. So I'm glad they're out there now. Thank goodness. All right. Thank you, Caleb.